I'm hoping you can all see the slides.
Yep.
Cool. So yes, I should also say, as I get cat hair out of my mouth, that we will almost certainly be joined by my cat because she has to be involved. As Max said, I'm Janet Goodall and I work at the University of Swansea, Swansea University, and my work is mainly around parent and family engagement. And it's also broadening to be community engagement because it is Wales and community focused schools are a real focus from Welsh Government at the moment. So if you take all of that into account, one of the first things I want to say is when I say parent, what I mean is an adult with a significant caring responsibility. Can I just ask you to put a yes in the chat if you are a parent? Have you got kids of your own? And how many parents are there? There are and I see lots of people coming in. Excellent. It fascinates me that often, particularly when I'm talking to teachers, they'll talk about parents as though they were a separate species, even though they are parents. And I find that really rather strange. When I say parents, I mean adults with a significant caring responsibility for the children. So that could be a parent. It could be another member of the family. We know increasingly it's grandparents. It could be somebody that's not related to the child in care. It could be somebody extra to the family. It might be a sports coach. It might be sorry, my computer's giving me weird notices. It might be a religious figure. I'm not going to keep saying that because it's too long. But when I say parent, it's not just biological parents, I mean. And the other thing I want to say is that there's far too much parent blaming going on in the world. The vast majority of parents are good parents, and you can see that from the fact that the vast majority of parents turn out okay. And if you are a parent, I would like you to pat yourself on the back if you can reach that far, because you've done a good job. And the thing is, when was the last time anybody told you as a parent you'd done a good job? When was the last time you told anybody else? I have fortunately reached the age where people assume I'm a grandmother and therefore I can say things like, I've really enjoyed listening to you talk to your children and nobody thinks it's weird. Grandmothers get away with these sorts of things. The first question that anybody asks about a research area is, why should we care? Why should we care about engaging parents with learning? And from my point of view, this is an issue of social justice. My background is theology. That's where I started out. That's what my early degrees are in. And for me, it's all about equity. It's about fairness. It's about making sure that children and young people have the best start in life. And I was talking to Max before that, Wales and Scotland have both enshrined the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in law. I'm bound by that by law, not just by morality. And to me, all of this is an issue of social justice. And this is very depressing. I promise not to leave you depressed, or I will try not to leave you depressed anyway. But we know that a huge number of children in our societies, in Wales, in Scotland, in the UK generally, children are living in poverty. These are figures from the Child Poverty Action Group, but I still figure they're probably an underestimate. I think there are probably more families in poverty because all it takes is a new tire. All it takes is the fridge going out. All it takes is one thing in a family budget. And World Book Day is coming up, and that's a bugbear of mine. How many families go into poverty because they've got to buy the costume in Asda? But the point is that, about a third of our children are dealing with the effects of poverty. That should not be the case. But that has an impact on what happens in the classroom. In a classroom of 30, around every fourth child in a school that's absolutely, in the middle band, and no school is, but will be dealing with the impacts of poverty. They may not have come to school with breakfast. They may not be going home to a warm house. They may not be going home to a hot meal. They may not have a coat in the winter. They may not know where they're actually sleeping that night, depending on the local authority they're in. That's no fault of their own, and it's probably not the fault of their parents. There is no they, there's only us. And this is a society we live in, and it's a society I'd like to change. And my way of changing it is working to support parents. And we know that the effects of children growing up in poverty, it has an effect on their education. It has an effect on their life chances. They're 6 times as likely to leave school without qualifications. And what's the first question on a job application? What are your qualifications? They're much more likely to leave school early. And according to the older literature, they're likely to have lower aspirations. Whoops, sorry. The older literature is wrong. Families experiencing poverty, particularly when their children are young, do not have lower aspirations than families in other bits of society. What they have is a lack of scaffolding to make those aspirations come true. Does that make some sense? It's not that they don't want their children to do well or go to Oxbridge or go to Glasgow or go to Swansea or whatever. It's that they don't know anybody who's ever filled in a UCAS form. They don't know anybody who's ever been to university. They don't know how to make those aspirations come true. And I would say in my discipline, where I'm working now, I would say at least 60% of my students are the first in their families to come to university. And that's a very different experience than if your parents went to university, if your grandparents went to university. But it's not about having lower aspirations. And there's a really good piece of work from Professor Morag Traynor, who I think is at Harriet Watt University, called Can We Put the Myth of the Poverty of Aspirations to Bed Now? And she brings the statistics, she brings the information. It's easily available, free online. Have a look at it, because the problem is that there's still a lot of people who think this is the case. And you read policy, you read documents, you listen to people talking as, oh, well, they don't value education. That's not true. But they may not know how to make education work for their children. They may not know how to make schooling work for their children. But the point of all of this is there are links between educational underattainment and underachievement and poverty. And it doesn't have to be that way. And it isn't that way in every country, but it is in ours. And I'm not going to read through all of this. You probably know this as well as I do if you're working in Scotland, but these are some of the statistics about Scotland. If you're not in Scotland, you can find these for Wales, you can find them for the US, you can find them for the other countries in the UK, you can find them for Canada, wherever you are. There's a gap. And there's a gap between children from advantaged and disadvantaged homes. There's a gap between children coming from homes that society values and homes that society doesn't. And the gap is not genetic. The gap is not about ability. The gap is about the way children are perceived, the way families are perceived, and how we support them. And I think we can do something about this. And a call like this or working with teachers always thrills me because it means that other people think there's something we need to be doing as well. And this quotation was about England, but I think it holds certainly for the rest of the UK. We report on how the country is faring in terms of tackling inequality. The message is clear. The gap is not going to close without systemic change. And that was 2020. 3 years on, I would agree with this. We've got to have systemic change, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have change on the ground as well. It's not either or. So why do I talk about parental engagement? And I very much take, I know that Professor Debbie Pusher is on this call somewhere as well, and I'm very thrilled to link up again. And Debbie has pointed out that we should probably be talking about parent engagement rather than parental, because parental makes parents an adjective. And that's a really, really good point. And I need to be much more careful about how I say that. But the point is that Rashbash and their colleagues are economists, and what they were looking at is where the impact is, what happens to children. And what they found was around 80% of the difference in how well children do, the difference in how well children from different backgrounds do, is down to what happens outside the school. Now, that's reasonably, you can understand that, because you don't tend to hear people in school saying, well, I know you 3 on free school meals, you can't learn this, don't try. Although if you're working in a secondary school that streams by ability, the chances are that you're also streaming by deprivation or postcode. And if you look at those 2 streams, you might well find that they overlap, because by the time you get to secondary school, a lot of this is already there. The gap is there before children start formal education. The point is that this is not down to schools to solve. So if there are teachers on the call, I'm not saying that you don't have a part to play in this. You have a huge part to play in this, but I am saying it's not just down to you. And we frequently sort of stick things on schools, you fix this. It's not just down to schools to solve. This is a societal issue. It's a systemic issue, but we've all got a part to play. And I think one of the parts, not the only one, but one of the parts is parents' engagement in their children's learning. And I don't mean parents coming into school. I'll get to that in a minute. But Stephen Gorard, if you know Stephen's work, he's at Durham University. And he and his colleagues were looking at where money should be spent to support learning. And what they said over a decade ago now, but I would still stand by this, is that parent involvement in their children's learning is the only thing that had enough causal evidence to say this is what we should be doing. He did make the point very clearly that there's not enough causal evidence, which is great because it keeps me in a job. But we do have enough evidence to know that this is important. This is something that we should be doing. However, and if there are any English teachers or literacy coordinators or anyone on the call who's doing that, I'm kind of hoping that most of you would agree with me that words are important. And I know we've got people on the call that are listening in their second or third language, and I'm really, really impressed, as I always am. But words are important. And three of the words that we mess up are learning, education, and schooling. And until we get those clear in our minds, we're always going to have a problem. And I love doing this in person, because when I do this in person, you can almost always tell who in the room is a parent because they lean forward. Just that little bit, because they want to pick the baby up, because that's one of the most charming looking children I've ever seen. But this definition, from Ambrose and Bridges et al., learning is a process, which makes it really difficult. And I apologize to any teachers or senior leaders on the call that you're trying to measure a process rather than a product. Good luck with that. But it's a product, it's a process that's internal to the learner. I can't make you learn. I can lead you to learning. I can be a learning supporter or whatever phrase we're using this week, but I can't make you learn. If I make you learn, if I change your knowledge from outside, that's indoctrination, that's not learning. Learning, at the very least, starts at birth. Whatever the first thing a child hears, whether it's, hi, I'm your mom, or what your name is, or God is good, or whatever it is, the first thing a child hears, they're learning. And it goes on at least until death. That isn't confined to school. It isn't confined to the schoolroom. Yet so often we hear people talk about lost learning because kids weren't in school. I've got an entire generation of kids that learned to bake in lockdown. Education is learning undertaken for a purpose. So in the high old kind of Greek sort of word, it's teleological, which is a wonderful theological phrase that the social scientists stole from us. It means something undertaken for a purpose. It's done for a reason, for an end. And I like the phrase there from Holly, that it's much easier to recognize than it is to define. Like all the other important things in life, like love and care and justice, it's much easier to notice them than it is to define them. But it's a way of helping people learn that we've decided works in groups. So it doesn't just take place in schools. It takes place in sports groups. It takes place in dance class, takes place in music class. It takes place in scouts and brownies. It takes place anywhere people are learning for a reason. Does that make some sense? Are you with me so far? Schooling is a subset. So if you think of three large circles, you've got learning out here, education, and within education, you have schooling. And schooling is a societally sanctioned program of learning and education. So in Wales at the moment, we're bringing in a new curriculum, completely revamped the curriculum, changed it all around, following something called the Donaldson Report, which will resonate with colleagues in Scotland. Schooling and education and learning are not the same thing. Going that way, they're subsets of each other. And the problem is that often we say education or learning when we mean schooling. And the problem is that cuts parents out. If we only think about schooling as a place, school as a place where learning can happen, we've really missed a trick. And again, think about all of the things a child learns before they go to school. They've learned to walk, they've learned to talk, they've learned to interact with other people. With any luck, they've learned to dress themselves. My kids went to school in Velcro because I failed hugely at teaching them to tie shoes, but they can now. They're in their mid-30s, they can tie their shoes. But we confuse these terms to our cost. And we are so focused, as Sidorkin says, on the tropes of classrooms and school teachers that we don't recognize learning when it happens elsewhere. And that is a real problem, particularly when we think about parents. And we had this whole discussion in lockdown about lost learning, which just fascinated me. Where did it go? When I lose my keys, they're somewhere. How do we know what was lost? The lost learning discourse works on arbitrary things where we all say that all 7-year-olds should be able to do X by the time they're 7. Well, anybody on the call who's had more than one child will probably figure out that your kids didn't do things at the same time. Mine were wildly different. One started running really early and hasn't stopped, and the other started talking really early and hasn't stopped. They're very different. They didn't do things at the same time. But the problem is we assume that this is learning and that this isn't, when we should assume that the first is schooling and the second is family. Can you see the difference? Does that make some sense? That's what allows us to talk about lost learning. And this is the quote I was talking about from Sidorkin. We focus too much on the concept of school, and therefore we can't see learning happening any other way. And we cut parents out, and we cut families out, we cut sports coaches out, we cut everyone else. And we can't imagine how education could be otherwise. And it's really interesting, if you look at the history of education in the 1970s and 1980s, people were writing really interesting stuff about what schooling would be like in the early 2000s, and they thought we wouldn't have any schools anymore. That everybody would have a computer and it would all be done online and all be Google, and we wouldn't have kids sitting in rows because of all of the ability that we would have with the knowledge base on the web. And of course, we've gone the other way, and we're more likened to this. The other thing that this allowed us to do during lockdown was talk about schools being closed. And I was working closely with schools all during lockdown. I suspect many of you were as well. And the schools did not close. Some of the buildings closed, but most of our buildings still didn't close because they were children of key workers. They were vulnerable children. But even when the buildings closed, the school community went on and learning went on. And we know that some head teachers were spending up to 5, 6, 7 hours a week on the phone to parents supporting learning. Schools didn't close. The buildings closed. Oh, I'm going the wrong way again. I am going the wrong way. My apologies. It's my husband's mouse. The confusion between these three causes problems for students as well as families. And this is a really old quote. It's now 2 decades old, but I still think it's worth using. This is work from Kathy Silva and her team at Oxford. Kathy's a professor of education at Oxford. And what they were looking at was whether or not organized educational experiences before formal schooling were useful to children. And not surprisingly, they found they were. But what they also found is what's on your screen now. For all children, the quality of the home learning environment is more important for intellectual and social development than parental occupation, education, or income. What parents do is more important than who parents are. There are a lot of phrases I would like you to jettison, and one of them is, what can you expect from that kind of parent? What you can expect from that kind of parent, whether that's a religious group, a linguistic group, a refugee group, somebody who lives on a particular council estate, whatever. What you can expect is they love their kids and want what's best for them. So this is what Max was talking about at the very beginning. And I know a number of you on this call have seen me do this many, many times, and my apology, zone out for the next 5 minutes, you're fine. But we were working with a number of schools across England, and we asked teachers, parents, and young people, secondary students, what was important about parents getting engaged. And what they said was what's on the screen now. Teachers said it was about reading in class, going on trips, and coming into parents' evening. And if you look at the work of someone like William James, who does statistical work around parent engagement, you'll find out that this has something like a 0.01% effect size. This doesn't change children's achievement. If you look at some of the work that's come out of the EU and the OECD, you can find out that this can actually broaden the gap. And the reason it can broaden the gap is that the parents that are comfortable coming into school to do all of these things are getting more support than the parents that may actually need the support. And if you work in school and you have parents' evenings, the chances are at the end of every evening you say, yeah, but I didn't see the parents I really wanted to see. And you've seen the worried well, not the parents you really want to see. When we asked parents, they said it was about helping with homework and keeping track of coursework. And my kids were teenagers when we did this, and keeping track of coursework was a full-time job. And we got the dreaded phone call, sorry to tell you, your daughter has missed her French exam. And we ran around like crazy because this was before kids had mobile phones. We couldn't phone her up and ask before we remembered that she was actually reading Spanish. Never name your child the most popular name. It's a really, really bad idea. Go for the unusual names. But this is what parents told us because this is what parents had been told. This is what you're told as a parent. Make sure they come to school. Make sure they wear the right uniform because apparently they can't learn if they're not in the right uniform. Don't ask. Make sure they're there on time and make sure that they turn in their homework. The interesting thing is what happened when we asked teenagers. Now, these are all secondary students. And bar one, all of the teenagers agreed that what they really wanted was what's on your screen at the moment. I need to move things around. They wanted moral support. They wanted parents to take an interest in their learning, and they wanted guidance. And what I heard over and over again, and if you have teenagers, you may be surprised by this, was they wanted someone to ask how their day went. And I heard that up and down England, rural, urban, leafy suburb, inner city. And as far as I know, my children did nothing in 12 years of formal education because every day I asked them and every day they told me, I don't know, I didn't do anything. So I started asking the young people, well, do you answer them? And I remember one young woman saying to me, no, God, no. But if my mum's not home, I go around all of my aunties until I find her, and then I make her ask me, and then I ignore her. But if she asks me, I know she cares. And that's what makes a difference. And again, if you go back to Bill Jane's work, if you want the stats, if you look at Debbie Pusher's work, if you look at my work, what makes a difference is somebody saying, I care. Somebody saying, I'm really proud of you. I know you're struggling with that, and I'm proud of you for struggling. What are you doing? What are you learning? It's about taking an interest. And we know there's OECD work that shows that 15 minutes a week conversation with teenagers is correlated to engagement with literacy. It doesn't have to be about schoolwork. Everybody thinks you need to be sitting in a book-lined room going, darling, how do you feel about Nietzsche? It's not. It's what are you watching? What are you learning? What are you watching on the movies? What are you watching on TikTok or Instagram? What music are you listening to? It's about showing an interest. That's what makes the difference. We have a systemic problem, and I said I wouldn't leave you depressed. How can we solve the systemic problem? Well, first we need to recognize what it is. And one of the first problems we have is we don't train teachers to do this. Because we're bringing in a new curriculum in Wales, and we've had all sorts of meetings with teachers, insets with teachers, all sorts of stuff to support them to deliver a new curriculum. What we're not doing is training them to support parental engagement in learning. And we recently did some work looking at all of the initial teacher education in Wales, and we found that all of the initial teacher education providers thought it was really, really important, but only 2 of them did anything about it. And one of them was my university, and they wheel me on for an hour and then they wheel me off. Because they couldn't, A, they couldn't fit it into the curriculum, and B, they didn't know what to do about it. But everybody agreed it was really important. But the problem is that we're asking teachers to do something they're not trained to do. And because of that, they may not recognize the support that's already going on with their students. And one of the things a lot of teachers don't recognize is why parents aren't engaging. And I don't care whether they're engaging with the school. I do care whether they're engaging with learning. And this quotation, and I realize it's a word-heavy slide, but I'm not going to apologize for it because I think it's so, so important. This is from Zadie Smith's Swing Time. It's on page 44 of the paperback volume if you want it. But she's talking about how her mother felt about parents' evening and how her mother's friends felt about parents' evening. We know that our mums in their own time feared school. They feared the arbitrary rules and felt shamed by them, by the new uniforms they couldn't afford, the baffling obsession with quiet, the incessant correcting of their original patois Cockney, the sense that they couldn't do anything right anyway, a deep anxiety about being told off. Anybody have a deep anxiety about being told off? I have a terrible anxiety. You know, you get that email from your boss that says, can we have a chat? And you immediately think you're being fired. We all have a deep anxiety about being told off. For who they were, for what they had or hadn't done, and now for the deeds of their children. The fear never left our mothers. And now they were afraid of what they were going to hear about their kids. In their minds, parents' evening wasn't so different from detention. The difference was that now they didn't have to attend. And again, it may be different in your context, but in Wales, when I go into a school, the first thing that happens is somebody takes my picture and they put it on a lanyard around my neck. That's fine, but now assume you're a parent who's just had a run-in with the police. You're a parent who's just had a run-in with a social. I'm not saying we shouldn't take a picture, but I am saying we could frame it and say, we're really glad you're here. We want to make sure that everybody who is here belongs here. Is it okay if we take your picture and we'll give it to you on a card? And that way we can instantly see that you belong here. Very different feeling, very different way of doing things. There are some real barriers to engagement, and we know that two of the big ones are parents' experience of education and parental self-efficacy. In other words, parents' belief in what they're doing. Parental experience of education, if schooling was a locus of failure for you, why would you go back? And the problem for teachers is that you're trying to repair bridges other people broke. That's not fair, but it is the reality. Unless you are still teaching the second generation of people. But we need to support parents to realize that education has changed and that schooling has changed. We also need to support parents to know they're doing a good job. When was the last time anybody complimented you on your parenting, and when was the last time you complimented a parent? It could be as simple as, you know, your little one takes such good care of their friends. Phoning a parent and just saying, look, he just had a really good day. I know I phoned you a lot to say that he hasn't had a good day. Today was a good day. He just did a really cracking piece of work. You know, ask him about his English homework. He just did such a cracking piece of work. Whatever it is, because we don't do it. We don't tell parents they're doing a good job. And then there's some other practical issues. Time. Parents are incredibly busy. Now more than ever, they're working 2 jobs, 3 jobs. If they're doing that much paid work, childcare, transport, and cost. You know, how do you deal with these things? How do you support parents around these things? We've known all of this for upwards of 25 years, and we've known it with more or less certainty. This isn't news. It's not news to anybody on this call. So why haven't we sorted out the problem? I think some of us may be part of the problem, and I very much hold up my hand. Some of my early work fed into the problem, and I'm really sorry about it. I would redact the articles if I could. We need to think differently about how we support parents, and we need to address it differently. And I think some of the stuff we do may actually be making the situation worse rather than better. And I really like this poster. How did the war on the poverty become the war on the poor? I think that's remarkably poignant. And I would have that up in every corner if I could. And there's a thing called the culture of poverty discourse. And it relies on the idea that there is a group of people who are the poor. Listen to politicians talk about people in disadvantage. And listen to some politicians talk about the deserving poor. I don't listen to those because I tend to throw things at the computer and it's expensive. But the idea is that everybody in poverty feels the same way about education. Scholars have been shouting about this for about a year less than it was published, because it takes a year to publish an academic article. But the idea is that it sees poverty as a personal choice. And think about some of the motivational posters you see around, you know, choose to be happy. I have no money, I can't feed my kids, and I know I'm homeless, but I'm supposed to choose to be happy. And one that I saw that I didn't rip down because it was on the internet, but I would have, poverty draws a line, choose to step over it. In other words, Yes, I know you're suffering the effects of poverty, but it's down to you to figure out the problem, not my problem, Jack. It's down to you. That is not the way society works, and that is not the way a representative society works. But as long as we hold these ideas, we are not supporting our families. And it relies on various ideas. And I can send Max an article to where I talk about this more because I haven't got the time. But one of the things that it relies on is the idea that the cream rises to the top. And that if you do well in society, it's because you're a good person. And for the historians among you, yes, Max Weber said this a long time ago. It's the Protestant work ethic. But the quote from David Cameron there sums it up. He said that he had attained his station in life now in the House of Lords, not because of the wealth of his family, but because of the warmth of his parenting. What does that say about people that don't attain that level of society, that level of education? Basically, it's saying your parents didn't do a good job. It's not the case. So I think there are some things we can do. And I'm rushing through this for the time, but I think we can change some of the terms, we can change some of the practice, and we can put some support in place. And one of the first things we can do is get radical. And there's, I hope, a bare-rooted plant there. And if we were in a room together, I would ask you why I have a bare-rooted plant there when I'm talking about getting radical. And I'm reasonably sure there's some people on the call that would understand the Latin root of the word radical. It means root. That's what a radish is. We need to get back to what school is for. School is about learning. We need to stop bolting stuff on the outside. And if you are a school leader and you have a school and get a school improvement plan, I would ask you why. Why do you want to improve the school? The normal answer is that the local authority makes me have a school improvement plan, but why not have a learning improvement plan? Because the school exists for learning. The school does not exist for the school. The school exists to support learning. We need to get back to being radical. We need to think about not getting back to normal. The discourse about getting back to normal drove me crazy. Normal wasn't that good. And on top of that, everybody has experienced this 2.5 year long trauma. I doubt there is any school anywhere that somebody hasn't lost a family member. And we're supposed to say to people, ignore the trauma? No. Acknowledge the trauma and build on what we got. And some of the things that were better during lockdown that we could build on were increased understandings between parents and school staff. And any number of school staff have said to me, wow, now I realize what parents do. And a wonderful quote from a teacher who said to me, my kids won't listen to me because they say I'm not their real teacher, which is the reverse. An increased understanding of parents of what school staff do. An increased understanding that sometimes staff are parents. Effective utilization of online tools. Why have we suddenly decided that all learning must go back to face when we know that for some of our children, online learning was really good and it benefited them? School teachers were often very good at the little 5-minute video. This is how you do this. This is how to explain it to your children. Why aren't we doing those anymore? There's a lot we could learn, but we could also change some of the terms. And this is one of the phrases I want you to ditch. Hard to reach parents. Well, who's hard to reach? Is it the parent or the school? When was the last time you actually looked at a school website and tried to find something if you weren't a member of the school body? When was the last time you phoned a school? I don't know about you, but I hang up at option 6. After option 6, I don't want to play anymore. Not happening. How do I get in touch with somebody? I am not arguing that school teachers and school staff need to be online 24/7. I'm absolutely not arguing that. But I am saying that parents need a reasonable expectation. Tell parents, we will respond to your emails within 2 working days. That's a reasonable expectation. Respond saying, yeah, I don't have an answer to this yet, but I'm working on it. It's not about being online 24/7. It's about reasonable expectations. But are hard to reach parents out of touch with the school, or are they out of touch with their children's learning? And how can we support either of those? And I think we can change the discourse. And this was mind-blowing for me when I first read this from Professor Gloria Ladstone-Billings. She talks about moving away from talking about the achievement gap to talking about an educational debt. Not an achievement gap, and educational debt. Can you see the difference between the two? It's not about those kids over there aren't achieving. It's about we as a society are failing those children. We have a responsibility to those children, particularly those of us in Wales and Scotland, where the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is enshrined in law. This isn't just something we need to do. We have a legal obligation to provide an equitable education for all of the children in our care, in our schools. It's a societal obligation. And can you see how that changes it? Let's stop talking about narrowing the achievement gap. And I won't talk about closing it, because there are always children who won't achieve whatever arbitrary standard we set. And if we know there are kids that won't achieve it, we talk about closing the achievement gap, we're saying those children don't matter, and I won't do that. We can overcome or dismantle some of the barriers. And this is what we're doing in Wales. This is the community-focused school project that's going on in Wales. Forgive me, I've reached the age where I have to put on reading glasses. And this is what we are working for, and there's money going into this from Welsh Government. There are family engagement officers working across clusters of schools. And it's, you'll note, it's not the school in the centre. It's the people in the centre. It's a child family-centered approach. It's a multi-agency approach. So we're doing incredible things like getting health visitors to talk to the police, to talk to schools, to talk to baby basics, to talk to everybody, and sharing as much information as is legal to share, so that the entire team around a family can actually work. There's a great deal of information around this online. I would suggest that you check it out. Drop me an email. I can put you in touch with people who are doing incredible work around this. And these are, I'm not going to go through all of these again, but as I say, Max has got this PowerPoint. I'm quite happy if you share it. This is what we're aiming for with community-focused schools. It's about multidisciplinary training. There's a lot of staff development going on. There's a lot of inter-school working and cluster school working, a lot of engagement with families. This is not about schools doing stuff and bringing it to families. It's about communities doing stuff together, including the schools, to move things around. If we go back to those barriers to engagement, transport is a real barrier for a lot of our parents. If you haven't got a bus schedule in your school, how are you planning something in the evening? Now, this depends on the school. I remember saying this to a school leader in Scotland, and she pointed out there weren't any buses on the island. So you need to think about how it works for you. But, you know, when do your parents work shifts? If you're saying to a single parent, no, you've got to come in on Monday, it's the only time I can see you, and that means that parent misses a shift, that may mean that parent's not eating. Kids will eat, parent may not eat. You know, when do your families celebrate religious holidays? You are very unlikely to have parents' evening on Good Friday, but the chances are extremely high for the next decade that you're going to have some event during Ramadan. That may not affect your school group, your school community. It may very much affect your school community. I'm not saying don't have an event, but I am saying if you're having an evening event and that and fasting during Ramadan impacts on your school community, talk to your parents and find out what to do about it. Share iftar, share the evening meal together. Makes far more sense than everybody rushing to get home. And I've mentioned the 15 minutes a week talking to teenagers. We need to let parents know they can make a difference, because everybody else in the world is telling parents they can't make a difference, and they're telling them they're not doing it well enough. And if you've got teenagers, your teenagers are telling you you're not doing it good enough, and your teenagers are telling you you can't make a difference. Yeah, they can. And what we need to let parents know is that it's not about content. It's about conversation. Parents need to be able to say the same things that teachers on the call would say. And if we had more time, I would ask you to put in the chat what you would say to a child if you're a teacher who says, oh, I can't do this. Well, you've got a bank of things you say to them. You can't do it yet. How do you think you could find out? Well, what's the problem? How do you, how are you going to, we need to share those with the parents. We need to let parents know it's okay to say, no, I don't know either. How are we going to find this out? Who can we ask? Explain the problem to me. Because the problem is when your children are quite little, you can answer their questions. Although I'm still trying to figure out why God made the dinosaurs first, which is what one of mine asked me. I have weird kids. But as they grow, you can't answer their questions. You can't answer their questions about their schoolwork. You can't answer their questions about why bad things happen to good people. You can't answer their questions about why what's happening in Gaza is happening in Gaza. You can't answer those questions and you feel like you're failing your kids. We need to let parents know they're not failing their kids. They're helping their kids learn that learning is lifelong. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is on Teacher Toolkit. You can look it up. What would Parents' Evening look like if it wasn't about reporting, but was about supporting? And one of the schools, a couple of the schools I've worked with, have started sending home questions that parents can ask at Parents' Evening and teachers can ask at Parents' Evening. The teachers' questions are things like, what do you know about your child that I don't know? What can you tell me about your child that will help me to help them learn? So for a very young child, it might be, my child will do anything for a dinosaur sticker. Offer them a dinosaur sticker if they're yours. For an older child, it might be, yeah, they're really struggling with math, but he can figure out the football scores. That's a way in for a maths teacher, because that's some fairly sophisticated mathematical working that's going on there. And the questions for parents were things parents could ask were things like, how can I help my child? What would help? It's about focus on the child, because that's where parents and teachers come together. We both want the children to do well. There's some really uncomfortable questions we need to be asking of ourselves as professionals and of our working environments. Am I perpetuating a deficit discourse? What am I saying about families? What am I saying about families to my colleagues? Is there a deficit discourse in my classroom, in my relationship? Am I using ableist or disadvantaging language? And it really helps if you've got someone who will catch you up on that. I fortunately have children that work in public services, and I'll say saying as that's ableist, Mom, you can't say that. Okay, fine. We need to be thinking about this. I want everybody on this call to become the sort of person that people say, oh, you can't tell that joke around them. No, they'll fight back if you tell that joke around them. Yes, I will. We've got to put engaging parents and supporting parents at the center of everything we do at school, because until we do that, we're not supporting some of our most vulnerable kids. It's not that these parents don't care. It's that we don't know how to help them, and they don't necessarily know how to help their kids, because most of us did reasonably well in school. We know how the game is played. If you don't know how the game is played, how do you help your children play the game? It's not necessarily about helping them know what an equilateral equation is. Please don't ask me what one of those is. It's about saying, look, I'll handle the content. You handle the conversation. They need to know that you love them. They need to know that you care. They need to know that you value their education. That's what parents really need to be doing. We need targeted, responsive, culturally appropriate support for engagement with learning. And it needs to be designed in conjunction with parents. Schools so often say to me, well, we put all this stuff on and parents didn't come. Well, no, did you ask them? My children's school put on a series of things called How to Deal with Teenage Behavior Issues. I didn't go. I was not about to go, because that would be admitting I had behavior issues with my teenagers. When they changed it to I've got a teenager, get me out of here, I had to go get more chairs. It's exactly the same thing. And we need to evaluate things effectively. Those of you who are teachers, and I can see some of you, have you got a house full of yogurt pots and empty loo rolls that are going to come in handy at some point? Once a teacher, always a teacher. You evaluate what you do. You walk out of a classroom and you think that did not go well. Or you walk out and go, that went really well. But we don't evaluate our work with parents in the same way. But it's part of teaching. It's not an add-on extra. The message we need to get across to parents is that what matters is that they care about their children and they care about their children's learning. They don't need to care. They don't need to know the answers. They need to care that the answers get found. And depending on your subject, on the level you're teaching, that can be something as simple as sending home something saying, David Attenborough's got a new series on. Here's some questions. Or, we're studying the Great Fire of London. Ask your children about fire. We're looking at fractions. When you divide up the pizza. Or, we're going to be studying this in history. Is there anybody in your family that remembers this? You know, my children came home at one point and asked if we had any Beatles tapes. And oh, yes. They were studying them in history, which made me feel far older than I actually needed to feel. But their grandparents remember World War II. There are a few other resources that I think are really, really useful. If you don't know this toolkit from the Child Poverty Action Group, please go away and find it. It's available online. It's incredibly important. I mentioned World Book Day. Nobody ever became a better reader because they bought a costume in Asda. They became a better reader because they found out what their parents read, because they discussed their favorite books, because they wrote a letter to Michael Rosen. And Poverty Proofing the School Day, again, available online, really, really important. It looked at poverty in school from the point of view of young children. We've got to realize that we are not making the world better if we're perpetuating the problem. The yellow t-shirt is a case in point, and I argue with Save the Children every single year about Christmas Jumper Day. Odd Sock Day, I don't know about you, but at the beginning of every year, I would buy 10 pair of gray socks, and every year I'd have to go out and buy another pair of socks and split them up between the children because we didn't have odd socks. You've probably seen this image. It's in the Creative Commons. Anybody can use it. It was created by an American teacher. It's a baseball game. And in the first image, you've got equality. And if anybody on the call is tall, can I just say thank you now for all of the times you've got stuff off supermarket shelves for people like me. I'm 5 foot nothing when I stand up very, very straight. The next one is equity, which is about where I think we are with the school system. It's where we're trying to get with the schooling system. People get what they need to overcome disadvantage. And that's good. And it's good, solid work. And I'm really pleased that we're doing it, but it's not the end of the road. The end of the road is liberation. Let's get rid of the disadvantage. That we have to do as a society. We can't do it as schools alone. We have to do it as a society. It is not going to happen in my lifetime, but I'm hoping that the kids I'm teaching in university and the kids they're teaching in school will have an effect. And if you haven't read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, go and read it this weekend. So that's where the idea of liberation is coming in. We need to liberate our children and our families. So it's over to you. That's me. I am still on whatever Twitter is calling itself this week. But you can find me at Swansea. Please note it's Janet Goodall. It's not Jane Goodall. I don't do anything with primates other than humans. Because this is what we want. We want families that are supporting learning and kids that are able to learn. Thank you very much. And I will stop